So let's dive into what we're going to be looking at today, which is really going to be the theme of some of the aspects we're gonna check out in the Machzor in this short series. The aspect of slicha, the aspect of the forgiveness ask that we are making of God on Yom Kippur, and try to understand exactly sort of what is the scene that we're acting out on this day of Yom Kippur. Because when you think of the major holidays in the calendar, in the Jewish calendar, they are all really connected to some sort of event. I mean, Pesach is the most obvious of the going out of Egypt. Shavuot is the receiving of the Torah. Hanukkah, Purim, these are all sort of events that happen, and then we're sort of celebrating along with them. Rosh Hashanah is a little bit different because it's sort of the day in which the world perhaps was created, or perhaps when people were created, and we're sort of celebrating that. But Yom Kippur, we often sort of disconnect or disassociate from any narrative event, and it's just sort of the day we ask for forgiveness and hope for the best. But there is a rabbinic understanding of Yom Kippur as the reenactment of a particular historical event. And that's what I want to sort of contextualize for us today before we move on to look at slicha, to look at forgiveness in the Machzor itself. And the event that we're driving to here is the event in which the Jewish people was forgiven for the sin of the golden calf. And when you think about the sort of the top sins in Jewish history, this one looms large because it was something that we sort of got the news was not okay to have any other gods at the Ten Commandments, and then sort of almost immediately, as it were, the Jewish people are running off to worship an idol. And so what we're going to discover is that Yom Kippur itself is the day in which we are forgiven for the sin of the golden calf. But it's not so easy, because when you do the counting from the Torah and the dates that we sort of know as markers, you wouldn't necessarily end up on Yom Kippur. But already a very old rabbinic tradition sort of drives us to Yom Kippur as the date in which we are forgiven for the sin of the golden calf. But it's wrapped up not only in forgiveness, but also in the re-giving of the Torah, or sort of the 2.0 on the Ten Commandments, the second set of tablets that Moshe brings down the mountain. So I want to look at exactly sort of what is the day of Yom Kippur commemorating on a narrative level, and how we get there. Okay, so there's an old midrash called Seder Olam Rabbah. Seder Olam, the order or the history of the world. And it's one of the oldest rabbinic set of midrashim, and its goal is to really take the events of the Torah, take the clues that we have to the calendar dates that the Torah gives us, and then spell out in an orderly fashion a sort of chronological, date-driven history of the Jewish people, starting from the creation of the world. So we're going to pick up in chapter 6, and this is almost the entirety of chapter 6 in Seder Olam Rabbah, where we get the calculation that's going to drive us to Yom Kippur. So let's start with one of the givens, which is the 17th of Tammuz. And we learned this elsewhere in the Mishnah, that the 17th of Tammuz was the date on which Moshe came down and broke the tablets. And indeed, if you count 40 days from the rabbinic date of receiving the Torah, so that's the 6th of Sivan when we celebrate Shavuot. So the next day, on the 7th of Sivan, Moshe goes up to heaven, and the Torah does describe Moshe sort of receiving the Torah for 40 days and 40 nights. So if you count from the 7th of Sivan, the day after Shavuot, until the 17th of Tammuz, you get 40 days. Okay, so far 17th of Tammuz actually works with the calendar. And the 17th of Tammuz is the day that Moshe comes down, having learned the entire Torah beyond just the Ten Commandments, which is sort of the start to the giving of the law, but not the end of it. And Moshe came down, saw the Jewish people were sitting with the golden calf, and Vishavar Deluchot, and broke the tablets. Then on the next day, Moshe said to the nation, you have sinned. And that is sort of the beginning of the forgiveness process that starts after the Jewish people sin with the golden calf. How does that forgiveness process work? It's going to be another set of 40 days. In order to get there, we have to read the first encounter with this narrative story in the book of Exodus with the retelling of the narrative story in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moshe sort of is reflecting back on what exactly happened at this time. So we read there that Moshe fell down in prayer before God for 40 days. Again, that's a quote from Deuteronomy, but basically, having spent 40 days on the mountain learning Torah, coming down, seeing the Jewish people worshiping the golden calf, and then going up for another 40 days that starts on the 18th of Tammuz. Okay, so that's where we find ourselves in this cycle. Now, what happens? Moshe goes up, prays for 40 days on behalf of the Jewish people, and indeed, at that moment, the Holy Blessed One was appeased to Israel. It works. So there is a sort of successful prayer. The 40-day prayer works. And God says to Moshe to carve a second set of tablets and to ascend. And then we get another verse from Deuteronomy, which gives us another marker point here. We're going to sum this all up if it's a little confusing, but we'll get the chart at the end. At that time, Hashem said to me, carve a second set of tablets like the first and go up to me toward the mountain, and I will make for you a wooden chest. That's the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 10. Okay, so what you have here is first 40 days, Moshe's learning Torah, comes down, sees the Jewish people sinning, breaks the tablets. Second 40 days, Moshe goes up and prays for the Jewish people, and it works, and God forgives them. But what date does that get us to on the second 40 days? So Moshe went down on the 28th of Av. Right now, we're only at the 28th of Av. We still have to get to Yom Kippur and carve the second set of tablets. As it says, he carved a second set of stone tablets like the first, and Moshe got up early in the morning and went up to Mount Sinai. Okay, so we've got the second set of 10 tablets, but then Moshe has to go up and learn Torah one more time, because it's not just the tablets, but Moshe has to go up and study the Torah. And this is going to be the third set of 40 days. So Moshe ascends on the 29th of Av and was taught Torah a second time, as it says, and this is the key verse for figuring us out how we're going to get to Yom Kippur. I stood on the mountain as on the first days, 40 days and 40 nights. And God heard me also at that time and did not want to destroy you. Okay, now this is a little bit confusing, because it seems like in this verse that Moshe is not just learning Torah for the current set of 40 days, but rather it's going to be some sort of, again, a prayer that God doesn't want to destroy the Jewish people. It's going to be a prayer to save the Jewish people from the punishment of destruction that would sort of reasonably come from worshiping the golden calf. This is where the creative part of the Midrash comes in. Just as the first days God was appeased, so too on the second days God was appeased, right? Because the verse says, as on the first day, I stood on the mountain as on the first days, i.e. the first set of 40 days and 40 nights, and God heard me also at that time and didn't want to destroy you. Now, the very first set of 40 days, Moshe was just up learning Torah, and there was no sin that was going on that God or Moshe was aware of. So it can't be speaking about the first set of 40 days from the 7th of Sivan to the 17th of Tammuz. Therefore, it has to be talking about the second set of 40 days when Moshe went up and asked for forgiveness. And so what we see here is, thanks to this verse in Deuteronomy, there are actually two attempts for Moshe to go up and pray on behalf of the Jewish people for their forgiveness. Attempt number one is the second set of 40 days, which takes us to the 28th of Av. And then Moshe goes ahead and does it again. And so what we see here is that the forgiveness that we get on Yom Kippur is not a straight up translation of the 40 days of prayer that follows the sin of the golden calf. That would only get us to the end of the month of Av. But it seems that Moshe goes up again, and while learning Torah for the second time, also prays for more forgiveness for the Jewish people for a second time. In other words, it's not a linear process of forgiveness. It seems like God is appeased, but actually God still seems to be angry, and Moshe has to go up a second time in order to ask for forgiveness. And that, the Midrash ends by telling us, Moshe went down on the 10th of Tishrei, which is Yom Kippur, and told them that they were accepted before God, as it says, that's one of the verses that we're going to get in the Machzor often, which is to say that Yom Kippur is the day on which we were forgiven again for the sin of the golden calf, right? If it was a linear process, it would have been 40 days studying Torah. Jewish people are worshiping the golden calf, smash the tablets, 40 days of forgiveness, 40 and 40. That's what it would have been if it was linear. But it's not just that. You get another set of 40 days in which Moshe is combining the first two activities of the first two sets of 40 days, learning Torah and asking forgiveness. That happens in the final 40 days, which ends with Yom Kippur. And then the Midrash ends by telling us, therefore, it was established as a day by law and memory for the generations. As it says, this should be an everlasting law. So Yom Kippur is something that we commemorate every year. And notice the forgiveness that we commemorate is not what could have reasonably been the beginning of the month of Elul. And indeed, there are some obviously connections to the month of Elul with a period of forgiveness. But Yom Kippur really is the end of the process that elongated and went for a second round of 40 days of Moshe asking for our forgiveness. And if you think about the ways in which forgiveness is not always a linear experience, that's part of what we're seeing here. Now, I brought you a chart, and if you have it in the email, I just sort of spelled out which verses are associated with which set of 40 days. And as you can see, there are three sets of 40 days. The first is just learning Torah. The second is just forgiveness. And the third is learning Torah and forgiveness, which ends with Yom Kippur. That's what we're headed towards here. And indeed, we have one other version of this Midrashic tradition that associates Yom Kippur with the culmination of Torah learning and not necessarily only forgiveness. Ben Betera said, for 40 days, Moshe was on the mountain, learning the words of Torah and investigating its letters. By this, the Midrash means the second learning after the breaking of the first tablets. And what happens? After 40 days, Moshe took the Torah and came down on the 10th day of the 7th month, which was Yom Kippur, and gave it to Israel as an eternal law. As it says, this shall be an eternal law for you. So in this telling of the same Midrashic calculation, Yom Kippur commemorates even not really forgiveness. Forgiveness is not headlined in this Midrash, but rather the giving of the law. And that's potentially why there's a happy element to Yom Kippur, which is sort of interlaced in some of our prayers. And part of the happiness is because we were forgiven, and that indeed is a cause for rejoicing. But part of it is we get the Torah again. It's sort of like a rerun of Shavuot. But this time it's a Torah that's received having already sinned and being forgiven. So all this sort of narrative background of Yom Kippur is going to set us up for understanding some of the references to slicha, to forgiveness, that we're going to find in the Machzor. And we're going to take a look at some of those references as we study again tomorrow. So I will see you tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. Eastern. Nice to learn with you all.